My name's David Bremner. This is my granddad's aircraft that he flew 100 years ago. What I'm going to do today is to tell you a little bit about what this aeroplane is like to fly. You need to bear in mind that it was designed in 1913. This is before the start of the First World War and only 5 years after people had learned practical flying. And it's an astonishingly advanced aeroplane. For the first 18 months of World War I, it was, I think, the fastest warplane at all of anybody. It was also the most manoeuvrable, and it was a very, very popular pilot's aeroplane. As you can see, it looks like any other World War I aeroplane. It's a standard biplane layout, and it's got a rotary engine. You can see that the whole engine rotates. So it's a dead loss oil system, and that's why the sides and the bottom and, well, everything on this aeroplane is just covered in castor oil. But flying the aeroplane, it's incredibly modern. I have a modern two-seat light aircraft, and the performance figures are almost identical. It's unbelievable how little progress we've made in 100 years. You know, the rate of climb's the same, the top speed's about the same, the stall speed's about the same. There are differences. The engine is obviously a lot heavier. The way you control it is different. On a modern aircraft, you just have a throttle control and you know, you make it go faster and slower, and that's it. This you can do to some extent, but not enough to make it actually run slowly. If you try and run it slowly, it throws out clouds and clouds of black smoke out the back and pops and bangs and sounds horrible. And also, if you open the throttle, it'll take a while before it sort of coughs and gathers itself to get going again. So you can get down to about half throttle just using it like a modern one. But if you want to come down any quicker, what you then do is you shut the throttle completely. And after about 5 or 10 seconds, the fuel in the system in the crankcase works its way out, and the engine stops firing at all. There's no slow running on it, and the engine just stops firing at all. And it's one of the most pleasurable experiences of flying this aeroplane, because you can just hear the wind in the wires, and the propeller just keeps on turning nice and slowly. You can actually feel the individual waft of each blade on your face as you're coming down. And then what you do when you get down to sort of somewhere nearer where, you know, maybe 1,000 foot or something, you open the throttle, and there's a little rather tense pause while you wait for the fuel to work its way through the system again, and she fires up. And then when you want to land it, you leave the engine on about half throttle or maybe a bit more, and then on the top of the stick there's a big red button, and what that does is to temporarily cut out the ignition. So you'll hear today, when both this aircraft and the Sopwith Pup, when we're landing, you'll hear this intermittent burp, burp, burp effect, and that's what we're doing. We're pressing the switch to slow the aircraft down so we can get down for a landing. And the reason we do it like that is because if we need full power, if we decide that the landing's not going right, we want to have another go at it, then we know that if we just take our finger off the button, the engine will pick up instantly, and you can, you know, fly around and have another try. You don't use the blip switch for any length of time, because all the time you've got the thing pressed down, fuel is being pumped in here, or it's being sucked in here, and so if you leave it down for long enough, you'll flood the engine, and then of course you take your finger off the button, and it takes a long time for it to clear itself and get going. So that's the engine. The Larone was always regarded as the nicest of the rotaries, and certainly ours has always behaved absolutely flawlessly for us. We had an interesting experience over the winter. This aircraft, because of all the stuff we've done with it, has run a hell of a lot more than you know, most of the other rotary engined aircraft, and we refurbished the engine. If you're interested in engines and engineering, have a look on the table there. I've got the old cylinder liner and the old piston, and you need to bear in mind that among the other indignities that has been subjected to, we ran it in Greece, flying from the exact same spot that my granddad flew from, but the airfield was basically marble dust, and there are no air filters on here. So that was one of the things. We also ran it on pure castor oil, which wasn't a good idea, but finally we ran it for half an hour with no oil. And you go and have a look. They're almost absolutely perfect, those. But we decided to replace them all anyway. And what we found this year, the performance of the engine before was adequate, but it wasn't what the original specs said. And something, we don't know what, has improved the performance of the engine out of all recognition. We're getting another 100 RPM, which equates to about 30% additional power, and the rate of climb has doubled from 400 feet a minute to 800 feet a minute. So that's really spectacular and almost justifies the stupendous cost of the repairs. As far as actually flying the aeroplane is concerned, the controls are just like my modern one. You've got a stick, you've got a rudder bar, you've got a throttle, and they're all in exactly the same place. They all do exactly, more or less, exactly the same thing. The differences are that this cannot handle crosswinds. One of the things we're currently doing is keeping an eye on the windsock over there, because we need the wind to be in line with the runway today before we can fly any of these First World War aircraft. It cannot do crosswinds. What happens if you, and I have actually done this so I can say from personal experience, if you try to land in a crosswind, as you start to, it all looks fine to start with, and as you start to slow down, you've just got it on the deck, you've got everything going, that looks fine, and as you start to do that, the tail starts to swing, and because you haven't got the propeller going, there's no air going over the rudder, so it doesn't do any good at all, and the swing gets faster and faster and faster and faster until eventually that wheel collapses. And then it slowly tips up on its nose like that. If you're unlucky, if you're going too fast, it'll tip up on its nose and over on its back. But we were very lucky with my accident. We replaced the wheel. There was a little dent in the cowling here, which was repaired, and we were back in the air again. So that's one very, very significant limitation. Obviously, because it's a very old aeroplane, it's a very precious one. This is actually the only airworthy Bristol Scout in the world. We would never, except under exceptional circumstances, fly outside gliding range from the airfield. I was told that with World War I aircraft, the ailerons, which are the control surfaces on the end of the wings, and they were quite a new thing in 1913, they're only really just coming into fashion, that they're completely ineffective. They really don't work at all. You just fly the thing on the rudder. That's what everybody said. Well, it's not true on this. This was the first aircraft that was fully aerobatic. It was capable of being spun under control. You could loop it, and you could even fly it inverted. But the controls are astonishingly good. There are two little things you need to bear in mind if you've grown up on a modern aeroplane. One is that on a modern aeroplane you would expect the stick to stay more or less in the middle as you're flying. It will recover itself to the middle position, which is where it's safe. This one doesn't. If you leave it go, eventually it'll work its way back until you're either sort of pointing right up like this or pointing right down like that. So you have to hold on to it all the time. And the other thing is that because of the rotary engine here, the huge rotating mass, big heavy propeller, big heavy engine, all going round and round, you get these complicated precession effects. It's a bit like, where you get hold of a bicycle wheel and somebody spins it, and then you try and do that and it does something weird. And that's precession, and that's what this does. And the net effect is that turning left is relatively straightforward, turning right is a good deal more complicated and anti-intuitive. And so if you watch when I'm flying today and you see me start a right turn and it doesn't seem to look right, you'll know that's that's what's happening. And it's, without going into it in tons of detail, that's because of this precession effect. Otherwise, as I say, it's an amazingly capable aeroplane. I have done some really bad landings in this, and it's survived far more than my modern aeroplane would. I know, some of the landings I've done with this would have damaged the undercarriage on my modern aircraft. So far, touch wood, and there's a lot of wood here to touch, this has behaved absolutely immaculately. It really is a delightful aeroplane to fly. Any questions? Yes?
Do you have control of the petrol air mixture as well, manually?
You do. Typically we don't use it a lot in flight on this particular engine. We found last year that leaving it in the middle, just the whole time, was okay. This year it's slightly different because the engine's behaving differently. And so, yes, but it's only occasional use with the mixture control. Yes.
Does the engine overheat at all? Because there doesn't seem an awful lot of area for the wind, for the air to go through.
Correct. The reason that the engine was designed like this was to try and keep the cylinders cool. As you know, with an internal combustion engine, it's always the problem. It was a very good solution in World War I because it was very robust. You could have a lot of action damage and the engine would still get you home. Whereas if you have the practical alternative, which is a water-cooled engine, you only have one bullet in the radiator and that's it. You know, you're going back, you're going down. But yes, you do have to watch the cooling a bit. It was something we were very aware of in the early days because, as you say, this hole at the front here is very small, but it seems to be okay. I've done a full power climb now with the increased horsepower that we're getting, and it does seem to be okay. Yes?
Is the fabric covering a modern fabric?
No, it's the original linen. Actually, the dope really hasn't changed. So we can use modern dope, and it's effectively the same as they would have had in 1913. But this is linen fabric, as is the pup. And the only downside with using natural fibres is that the dope continues to shrink them throughout their life. So after maybe 10 years or so, there is a risk that the fabric will actually start to crush the airframe. But by that time, it will have got so filthy, we want to replace it anyway. Yeah, Fid.
You said earlier on that the specification was really good, top plate and top plane. If my memory's right, there weren't too many made. Why was that?
It was primarily because at the early days of the war, they didn't know how many aircraft they were going to need. Essentially what happened was that although this was designed as a reconnaissance machine, it was never really used as that. You'll see on the panel up at the end there, some of the different ways in which pilots experimented with fitting armament to these aircraft. This one here, in my granddad's case, they've got an unsynchronized Lewis gun, and they just doped fabric on the propeller to stop the splinters coming off in your face. Which sounds dangerous, but actually Max Immelmann, with flying a Fokker Eindecker with a synchronized gun, died because he shot his own propeller off. The synchronizing gear was very unreliable as well. So whatever you did, was a fairly poor solution. But the point was that this was the first aircraft that was fast enough and sufficiently maneuverable to be capable of chasing after another aeroplane. There was no other aircraft at the outbreak of the war that would do that. And so it was what really gave people the idea that you needed a single-seat aircraft with a forward-firing gun was the way to go. But by the time they'd cottoned onto that, the aircraft is absolutely tiny, the cockpit's tiny. My granddad was also 6'3", and he said that he had to take the cushion out to fly the aeroplane, and I have to take the cushion out to fly the aeroplane. He also had the stick extended by 2 inches to help his fist clear his knees. It's a tiny little cockpit, so there really wasn't room for a permanently installed gun. It had never been designed for that. And so by the time they'd done this, they'd done all the experimenting with the Bristol Scout, they moved on to the Sopwith Pup, which was designed from the start with a synchronizing gear and designed to be an interceptor. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.